Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you for organising tonight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start by saying something perhaps slightly surprising, which is a thank you to colleagues in the rail industry. I'm one, like many of you probably, travel on the railways most days, and actually I think it's astonishing the number of people the rail industry manages to move successfully in and out of a city like London. And you only have to see how successful it is when you look at the days when it doesn't work, and the sense of panic that sets in when trains stop at Royston and all the rest of it. And staff I briefly mentioned at the beginning, but I don't think you can run a successful industry without motivated staff. And I pay tribute to staff and managers who have inherited, I'd say, a system from the politicians, which is quite often been quite difficult to manage and work. And I think one of the challenges we've got is to give you a better system to work in the future. The Labour Party comes at this very much from the point of view of how it feels for customers at the moment. And I hear Julian's optimistic account of how it feels, but I have to say it's not what I hear from most people. When you look at the amount of money people are spending, the over £800 extra that people are spending on a season ticket to London since this government came into power, that doesn't feel great. And part of the reason there's a problem, of course, with using the inflation figures, is that, of course, for a long time, wages used to rise faster than prices. And we're now in the post-2008 world in a completely new situation where wages are falling behind prices. So the whole RPI formula issue is part of the problem. And I look back at what I used to spend when I started working in London a decade ago on rail fares, and it's roughly doubled. And I look at my take-home pay, and I'm not complaining because I'm actually quite privileged compared to most, but I tell you, it hasn't doubled. And most people's pay hasn't doubled. And that's the problem, essentially, that people are paying much, much more. So we've got to do something about that. And Labour's plans are, I'll just briefly run through the headlines, and people can come back and ask more questions on them. I mean, in terms of the fare rises, we're not happy with the way some of the operators, the train operating companies, have used the flex system to basically manipulate the system and impose some very high price rises in some places. So the flex system will have a clear price cap, so everyone will know how much it's limited to go up each year. We're also, and I'm sure Passenger Focus would agree with this extraordinary labyrinth of rail fares that people face. We'll introduce a legal right to the cheapest fare. And I think passengers will appreciate that, because this nonsense of having to buy split ticketing and all the rest of it is a total nightmare. Of course, in the end, it doesn't ought to be over all fare income coming in. It's about how you distribute it, and there are debates to be had about how you do that. But we think it's got to be simplified. On the franchising, we also think, of course, and I mean, this is fairly familiar now, and it's a bit of a nonsense the way the franchising system's worked. It's been a disaster, of course, in the last few years in the Department of Transport. Of course, that's what happens if you make massive cuts too quickly and don't think it through. It becomes more expensive. And of course, you have to go back and start again because you get legal challenges because you do it wrong. We've seen all that, and the huge costs of the Department of Transport are messing it up. So we're going to have a complete review of how the franchising system works. But of course, alongside that nonsense is the nonsense that you've got state-owned companies in other parts of Europe being able to bid franchises where you can't have a public body competing in this country. So we saw with East Coast Main Line that it can work much better, it can return much more money to the taxpayer, it can be successful. How astonishing this government didn't allow that to stay with directly operated railways. So we will correct that anomaly. I know some people in the industry say it's difficult and expensive. Well, people always say that. I'm old-fashioned enough to remember competitive tendering and best value in local government. You often need a public sector comparator to keep the private sector honest, quite frankly. And that's what we will be doing. We've also identified fragmentation in the industry as a huge problem. We could have a discussion about the role of markets in providing public services. I mean, there is market failure across a whole range of industries at the moment. And part of Labour's big analysis, and I think it is a big analysis, is what you do when markets don't work properly. And the answer for us is you intervene. So that's why we will try and impose some order on a fragmented system, to use the jargon, the guiding mind. And it won't just be Network Rail, but I think we will be looking to build on what you do in some ways to try and deal with those issues where, quite frankly, the market just does not work in terms of achieving the holy grail of anything remotely like an integrated transport system. We think there's an issue around the rolling stock companies. The way the privatisation was done originally was, in our way, we opposed it at the time. There was a huge amount of money lost and wasted. For people who are very interested in Roscoe's and all the rest of it, it looks more like a financial financing system rather than a rolling stock operation, and we want to address that as well and try and make sure the kind of trains that passengers in a place like Cambridge are going to be getting in the next year or two are the kind of trains that people would expect to have. And certainly looking at some of them that are coming next year, I think people are going to get a bit of a shock when they see that we're effectively getting commuter trains rather than anything remotely like an intercity train. And that's something that I will be raising over months ahead. Finally, because I suspect I'm getting towards my 5 minutes, is devolution of powers, particularly for regional and local railways. I think it's a big opportunity, Scotland, Wales, and of course down to our regions. We think that's the way you can actually do things better, and it will tie in with our plans to transport in areas like Cambridgeshire. We may talk about bus re-regulation later in the evening, but it ties together with that as well. Now I think that taken together, that's a powerful package that is doable, it's achievable, it's actually pretty radical. I think it might begin to give us the kind of railway system we deserve in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you all for coming here today and giving up your evening to listen to a group of politicians, but particularly of interest to me were the facts and figures in terms of passenger focus. And really, it seems that whether you nationalise or whether you privatise, what passengers are interested in is an efficient service that's punctual and that delivers value for money. Rail fares have been a historic problem in this country, encompassing issues of rolling stock, track and franchises. Privatisation in principle has been good. It is the execution that has presented a challenge. Innovation in stations like King's Cross, Manchester, Birmingham New Street has come about in part through privatisation. Nationalising the railways would ultimately cost the taxpayer billions and mean that the railways would have to compete against other services such as armed forces, hospitals, schools for public funding. It's not the job of government to run a business. 8% of people regularly use the train services in this country. And therefore, it would be irresponsible to pass that burden on to all taxpayers. It is regrettable that fares have had to go up, but after decades of underinvestment, we are now faced with the opportunity to invest £38.5 billion into our railways in this country, which haven't really been upgraded since the Victorian era. So that small increase, which is actually the lowest increase for over a decade, is being passed on to consumers. And we regret that, but it's something that we are planning and thinking ahead for the future. This next election is going to determine the future of this country for the next 20 to 50 years. That's your opportunity to decide. Privatisation actually allows us to sack poorly performing contractors, whereas nationalisation does not help incentivise anyone to invest in that service. It enables people to increase costs without any form of redress to the passenger. The other point I'd like to make is that privatisation has led to innovation, newer rolling stock, better tracks. We have electrified around, we aim to electrify around 850 miles of track. Under Labour, only 10 miles of track were electrified. Daniel mentioned Flex. Actually, that was a policy introduced by Labour and abolished in this government this year. My personal view is we need to think bigger. Rather than hark back to a bygone era of dirty trains, delayed services, strikes, we need to look at how we can get private investors to invest more. Open the door to new investment, maybe even overseas investment with a tax incentive for upgrading the actual rail network and delivering a first-class rail network for the future. East Coast Trains has been mentioned and championed as a public sector operated train service. Actually, under the public sector, in 5 years of that franchise, it only returned £1 billion to government. Under the new franchise, it is expected to return £3.3 billion to government. Long franchises is something that I would like to see. That would allow for systematic investment designed for the benefit of the passenger, with the continued accountability to the passenger. I want to see franchises with the tangible goals towards the environment, cutting carbon emissions through efficient fuel technology, making rail transport an attractive alternative to the roads. Maybe even adding those creature comforts of Wi-Fi and reclining chairs, and some of the basics, clean toilets, places for mothers to put their prams and pushchairs, better access for disabled people. We must get past the poverty of ambition and deliver what customers want, whilst protecting our environmental future and delivering value for money. Thank you very much.